In the vast expanse of Montana's cattle country, Samuel "Sam" Morrison lives as a solitary rancher on 500 acres of inherited land. After losing his wife in a car accident 3 years ago, Sam has isolated himself from the community, maintaining only essential contact with neighboring ranchers. His quiet existence is disrupted when he discovers a broken section of fence on his property line, allowing several wild horses to seek shelter on his land during a harsh winter storm. Sam's simple act of mending the fence and providing temporary refuge for these animals sets in motion a chain of events that will reconnect him with a community he never knew was watching over him, ultimately teaching him that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of profound change. The February wind cut across the Montana plains like a blade forged in the Arctic, carrying with it the promise of another brutal storm. Samuel Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his weathered frame as he stepped onto the front porch of his ranch house, the wooden boards creaking under his boots, despite the bitter cold that should have silenced such sounds. At 52, Sam carried himself with the measured gait of a man who had learned to find comfort in solitude, though the lines etched deep around his eyes spoke of sorrows that went far beyond the harsh realities of ranch life. The sky hung low and grey above his 500 acres, pregnant with snow that would likely start falling before nightfall. Sam's breath formed small clouds as he surveyed his land, a ritual he'd maintained every morning for the past 15 years, though the last 3 had felt markedly different. Where once he'd shared these quiet moments with Margaret, pointing out the subtle changes in weather patterns or discussing plans for the day ahead, now he stood alone, the silence broken only by the distant lowing of his cattle and the persistent whistle of wind through the fence posts. His property stretched toward the horizon in 3 directions, bordered by the Yellowstone River to the east and the sprawling wilderness of the Beartooth Mountains rising majestically in the distance. It was beautiful country, the kind that could heal a soul or break it depending on a person's disposition, and Sam had experienced both extremes since Margaret's accident. The semi-truck had run a red light in Billings during what should have been a routine supply run, and in an instant, his world had collapsed inward like a dying star. Sam descended the porch steps, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel as he made his way toward the barn. The structure stood solid and dependable, its red paint faded, but its bones still strong after decades of Montana weather. Inside, his border collie, Rex, lay curled on a pile of old blankets, his graying muzzle lifting as Sam entered. The dog had been Margaret's idea, a companion she'd insisted would help with the cattle work, though Sam suspected she'd simply wanted another living thing to fuss over and spoil. "Morning, boy," Sam murmured, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the blankets, a gesture that had become increasingly subdued since Margaret's passing. Animals, Sam had learned, grieved in their own quiet ways, and Rex seemed to understand that their small family had been diminished in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. The morning routine was well established: check the cattle, inspect the water troughs for ice, and walk the fence line. The latter had become increasingly important as winter deepened, not just for keeping his own livestock contained, but for maintaining the boundaries that defined his relationship with the world beyond his property. Sam had always been a private man, but since losing Margaret, those boundaries had become walls, necessary barriers that protected him from well-meaning neighbors and their inevitable invitations to church dinners or community gatherings. He loaded his truck with fence repair tools, coils of wire, and wooden posts, though he hoped he wouldn't need them. The weather forecast called for temperatures to drop another 10 degrees by evening, making any outdoor repairs a miserable prospect. Rex hopped into the passenger seat without invitation, a privilege Sam had granted more frequently since finding himself talking to the dog during long solitary days. The drive along his fence line took them through terrain that showcased Montana's raw beauty, even in winter's grip. Snow-covered pastures rolled toward distant peaks, dotted with clusters of Angus cattle that had learned to huddle together for warmth. The fence itself was a testament to generations of ranching tradition, a combination of wooden posts and barbed wire that had been maintained and repaired countless times over the decades. Sam spotted the problem before he'd even stopped the truck. A section of fence near the northwestern corner of his property had collapsed, the wooden post snapped by what appeared to be the weight of accumulated snow and ice, combined with the relentless pressure of winter winds. But it wasn't the damaged fence that made him pause in surprise. It was the sight of 7 horses standing quietly in his pasture, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. These weren't domestic horses. Sam could tell immediately by their build and bearing that these were wild mustangs, likely descendants of the herds that had roamed this country for generations. Their coats were thick and shaggy, adapted for harsh winters, and their eyes held the alertness of animals that had learned to survive without human intervention. They'd clearly taken shelter on his land, seeking protection from the storm that was building on the horizon. Sam stepped out of his truck slowly, not wanting to spook the animals. Rex remained in the passenger seat, sensing his owner's caution. The horses watched Sam with calm curiosity rather than fear, as if they understood that his land represented sanctuary rather than threat. The largest of the group, a bay mare with intelligent eyes, took a few steps closer, her head held high but her posture non-threatening. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam muttered under his breath, surprised by the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. There was something about these creatures that stirred something long dormant in his chest, a reminder of the connection he'd once felt to the land and its wild inhabitants. The approaching storm made his decision simple. Sam retrieved his tools from the truck and began working on the fence, not to keep the horses out, but to provide them with better shelter. He reinforced the broken section with sturdy posts and strung new wire, creating a temporary windbreak that would help protect the animals from the worst of the weather. His hands, already numb from the cold, worked with practiced efficiency born of decades spent maintaining his property. As he worked, the horses moved closer, no longer wary of his presence. The bay mare came within 10 feet of where he was digging post holes, close enough that Sam could see the frost forming on her whiskers and the way her dark eyes seemed to convey gratitude for his efforts. It was a moment of connection that caught him off guard, a reminder that kindness, even toward wild creatures, could create bonds that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. The snow began to fall as Sam finished his work, large flakes that clung to his jacket and quickly began accumulating on the ground. He loaded his tools back into the truck, pausing to take one last look at the horses that had found refuge on his land. Tomorrow, he knew, they would likely move on, following whatever ancient patterns had brought them here in the first place. But tonight, they would be safe, and that knowledge brought Sam a satisfaction he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. Sam woke before sunrise, as had been his habit for 30 years of ranch life, but this morning felt different. The house seemed quieter than usual, if such a thing were possible, and the quality of light filtering through his bedroom curtains suggested that the predicted storm had delivered on its promise. He rolled out of bed, his joints protesting the cold that had settled into the old ranch house overnight, and shuffled to the kitchen window to assess the damage. What he saw made him stop mid-stride, his coffee mug freezing halfway to his lips. The world outside had been transformed into a pristine white landscape, with nearly 8 inches of fresh snow blanketing everything in sight. But it wasn't the snow that captured his attention. It was the sight of at least 100 riders arranged in a perfect semicircle around his property, their horses dark silhouettes against the brilliant white canvas of morning. Sam rubbed his eyes, certain that the early hour and perhaps too much whiskey the night before were playing tricks on his vision. But when he looked again, the riders remained, motionless as sentinels, their breath and that of their horses creating small clouds in the frigid air. Even from this distance, he could see that they weren't threatening in any way. Rather, they seemed to be waiting, watching his house with what appeared to be respectful patience. Rex had noticed them too, his low whine drawing Sam's attention to where the dog stood at the kitchen door, his tail wagging uncertainly. The border collie's instincts were conflicted. These were strangers on his territory, but their calm demeanor suggested they posed no threat to his human or their land. Sam set his coffee mug on the counter with hands that had developed a slight tremor, not from age or cold, but from the surreal nature of what he was witnessing. In 3 years of self-imposed isolation, he'd grown accustomed to the solitude of his mornings, the predictable routine of checking cattle and maintaining his property without human interference. This gathering of riders represented something entirely outside his experience, and for a man who'd spent the last 1,000 days avoiding social contact, it felt overwhelming. He pulled on his boots and jacket with movements that felt mechanical, automatic responses to a situation his mind hadn't yet fully processed. Rex followed him to the front door, both of them peering through the glass panels that flanked the entrance. The riders were closer now, perhaps 50 yards from his house, and Sam could make out individual faces beneath winter hats and pulled-up collars. The nearest rider was a woman he recognized as Elena Vasquez, whose family had run the adjacent ranch for 2 generations. Her husband Miguel sat beside her on a sturdy paint horse, and beyond them, Sam began to identify other faces from the local ranching community, people he'd known for years but had actively avoided since Margaret's funeral. There was Tom Brennan from the Double B Ranch, Sarah Chen, who raised quarter horses 10 miles east, and at least a dozen others whose names he could recall from better days when he and Margaret had been active members of the local ranching association. But it was what they carried that truly bewildered Sam. As his eyes adjusted to the morning light, he could see that nearly every rider bore some kind of offering. Some held bundled hay bales across their saddle horns, others carried what appeared to be bags of feed grain. Several had thermoses that likely contained hot coffee or soup, and he could make out the distinctive shapes of casserole dishes wrapped in towels to retain heat. Sam's throat tightened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. These people, his neighbors, his community, had somehow learned about his small act of kindness toward the wild horses and had responded with an overwhelming display of support and generosity. It was the kind of gesture that Margaret would have understood instinctively, the unspoken code of rural communities where neighbors looked after neighbors regardless of personal differences or social distance. Elena Vasquez dismounted from her horse and approached the house on foot, her movements deliberate and respectful. She stopped at the base of his porch steps, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough away to avoid seeming presumptuous. Her weathered face carried a warm smile that reminded Sam of the countless community gatherings he'd attended before grief had driven him into isolation. "Morning, Sam," she called out, her voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "I hope you don't mind the early visit. We heard about what you did for those Mustangs yesterday and, well," she gestured toward the assembled riders with a sweep of her arm. "The community wanted to show our appreciation." Sam opened his front door slowly, Rex immediately bounding past him to investigate this unexpected gathering. The dog's enthusiasm seemed to break some of the tension, his tail wagging as he trotted toward Elena with the confidence of an animal who remembered when visitors were welcome at the Morrison Ranch. "I don't understand," Sam managed, his voice rusty from disuse in social situations. "I just fixed a fence, nothing special about that." Elena's smile widened, and Sam could hear gentle laughter from some of the other riders. "Sam Morrison, you provided shelter for 7 wild horses during one of the worst storms we've had this winter. In this community, that's everything special." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "We know things have been hard for you since Margaret passed. We've respected your need for space, but we wanted you to know that you're not forgotten. You're still part of this community, whether you feel like it or not." The words hit Sam like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they carried a kindness he'd forgotten existed. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that his isolation was protection, that keeping the world at arm's length would somehow make the pain of loss more manageable. But standing on his porch, looking out at 100 neighbors who had ridden through snow and cold to acknowledge a simple act of compassion, Sam felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Miguel Vasquez had dismounted and was approaching with what appeared to be a large thermos and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Elena made her famous breakfast burritos," he called out with a grin. "Figured you might be hungry after working in that cold yesterday." Other riders were dismounting now, each carrying their contributions toward the house. Sam watched in amazement as his front yard filled with neighbors he'd spent 3 years avoiding, their faces bright with genuine warmth despite the frigid temperature. There were the Henderson twins from the H-Bar-H, old Pete Kowalski who ran sheep on the Eastern Range, and Maria Santos, whose family had been ranching in Montana since before statehood. "This is too much," Sam protested weakly, though he made no move to retreat into his house. "Really, I just fixed a fence." "No, Sam," said a voice from the back of the group. Sam looked up to see Pastor John Whitehorse from the reservation, a man whose wisdom was respected throughout the county, regardless of religious affiliation. "You saw creatures in need, and you helped them, expecting nothing in return. In our culture, such actions create ripples that extend far beyond the original act. What you gave to those horses, you gave to all of us." The next hour passed in a blur of activity that Sam couldn't have imagined when he'd awakened that morning. His front yard, typically silent except for the wind and occasional cattle calls, had been transformed into something resembling a community gathering. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in 3 years moved around his property with the easy familiarity of people who understood ranch life, organizing their contributions with an efficiency that spoke to generations of mutual support during difficult times. Elena Vasquez had taken charge of coordinating the food offerings, transforming Sam's kitchen table into an impressive buffet that would have made Margaret proud. There were breakfast burritos still warm from Elena's kitchen, a pot of Sarah Chen's famous chili that had won the county fair 3 years running, fresh baked bread from the Kowalski family, and at least 6 different types of homemade cookies that filled the house with scents Sam had forgotten he missed. Outside, the men were stacking hay bales in his barn with practiced precision, adding to his winter stores without being asked. Tom Brennan and his teenage son Jake were checking his water troughs, chipping away ice, and ensuring his cattle had access to fresh water. The Henderson twins, known throughout the county for their mechanical skills, had somehow diagnosed and repaired a persistent problem with his barn door that had been sticking for months. Sam stood in his own kitchen feeling like a stranger in his own life, watching his neighbors move through his space with purpose and kindness that made his chest tight with emotions he'd spent 3 years suppressing. Rex had appointed himself as the unofficial greeter, his tail wagging constantly as he received attention from visitors who remembered him from happier times. "You look overwhelmed," observed Pastor Whitehorse, appearing at Sam's elbow with a steaming mug of coffee. The older man's weathered face carried the kind of wisdom that came from decades of helping people through their darkest moments. "That's understandable. Grief has a way of making us forget that we're not meant to carry our burdens alone." Sam accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to study the pastor's face. John Whitehorse had officiated at Margaret's funeral, had been one of the last people Sam had really spoken to before retreating into isolation. The memory of that day, the overwhelming sympathy, the well-meaning but painful condolences, the sense that everyone was watching him for signs of how he was coping, had been part of what drove him to seek solitude. "I didn't know how to be around people anymore," Sam admitted quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "After she died, everything felt different, like I'd forgotten how to be part of the world." Pastor Whitehorse nodded with understanding. "Grief changes us, Sam. It has to, because the world we knew no longer exists, but that doesn't mean we have to face the new world alone." He gestured toward the window, where Maria Santos was helping her grandson carry bags of feed grain toward the barn. "This community has been waiting for you to be ready. What you did for those horses yesterday, that was you being ready, even if you didn't realize it." Through the kitchen window, Sam could see the horses in question. The 7 Mustangs had remained on his property, staying close to the windbreak he'd created for them. Several of the visiting ranchers had commented on the animals, noting their healthy appearance and calm demeanor. Wild horses were often skittish around large groups of people, but these seemed content to graze peacefully while the humans bustled around their temporary sanctuary. "They're beautiful animals," said a voice behind him. Sam turned to find Maria Santos standing in his kitchen doorway, her gray hair pulled back under a knitted cap, her eyes bright with genuine warmth. Maria was a widow herself, having lost her husband Carlos 5 years earlier in a ranching accident. If anyone understood the particular loneliness of losing a life partner, it would be her. "I keep expecting them to move on," Sam replied, watching as the bay mare lifted her head to observe the activity around the ranch. "Wild horses don't usually stay in one place this long." Maria moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence comfortable rather than intrusive. "Maybe they recognize sanctuary when they find it," she suggested. "Animals have instincts about such things. They can sense when a place is safe, when the person providing shelter has a good heart." The simplicity of her words carried a weight that made Sam's throat constrict. For 3 years, he'd seen himself as broken, as someone who'd lost the ability to connect with others or contribute meaningfully to his community. But these horses had seen something different in him, had trusted him enough to stay on his land and accept his protection. "I haven't been a very good neighbor," Sam said, the admission painful but necessary. "Since Margaret died, I've pretty much shut everyone out. Didn't return calls, avoided town, made it clear I wanted to be left alone." Maria's smile was gentle but firm. "Grief isn't a character flaw, Sam. It's the price we pay for having loved deeply. No one in this community judges you for needing time to heal, but we also won't let you disappear completely, because that's not what Margaret would have wanted." The mention of his wife's name sent a familiar stab of pain through Sam's chest, but for the first time in months, it was accompanied by something else. A warmth that came from knowing that others remembered her, that her impact on the community hadn't been forgotten along with his own withdrawal. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the cold but her expression radiating satisfaction. "I think we've got everything organized out there," she announced. "Your winter stores are looking good, and Pete found that loose board on your chicken coop that was letting the cold in. Sam shook his head in amazement. "You all didn't need to do this. I don't know how to repay—" "Sam Morrison, you stop right there." Elena interrupted with the authoritative tone of a woman who'd raised 4 children and managed a ranch for 30 years. "This isn't about repayment. This is about community. This is about neighbors taking care of neighbors, which is exactly what you did when you saw those horses needed help." Through the window, Sam watched as several of the younger visitors, Jake Brennan, Maria's grandson Diego, and the Chen family's daughter Lily, had gathered near the fence where the Mustangs grazed. The horses seemed curious about these young humans, the bay mare approaching close enough that Lily was able to extend her hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. "Look at that," whispered Maria, following Sam's gaze. "Even the children can feel it. There's something special happening here, something that goes beyond just fixing a fence." Sam watched as more of his neighbors gathered near the horses, their voices low and respectful, their movements careful not to spook the wild animals. But the horses seemed remarkably calm, as if they understood that they were witnessing something significant, a community coming together, barriers being broken down, connections being rebuilt through the simple act of shared compassion. Pastor Whitehorse placed a gentle hand on Sam's shoulder. "Sometimes the healing we need most comes not from isolation, but from remembering that we're part of something larger than our own pain. Those horses didn't just find shelter on your land, Sam. They found a bridge back to your community." 3 weeks had passed since that extraordinary morning, when 100 riders had surrounded Sam's ranch, and the changes in his daily routine were both subtle and profound. The Mustangs had finally moved on 5 days earlier, but not before leaving an indelible mark on both Sam and the community that had witnessed their temporary sanctuary. Their departure had been as peaceful as their arrival. Sam had awakened one morning to find them gone, leaving only hoof prints in the snow and a repaired fence that now stood as a symbol of something far greater than property maintenance. The kitchen table that had once served as his solitary dining space now regularly accommodated visitors. This morning, Elena Vasquez sat across from him, steam rising from 2 cups of coffee as they reviewed plans for the annual spring roundup. It was a conversation that would have been impossible just a month ago, when Sam's isolation had made him forget that ranching was inherently a community endeavor. "The Henderson twins are willing to bring their horses and help with the branding," Eleanor was saying, her finger tracing routes on a hand-drawn map of the local ranches. "Tom Brennan thinks we can finish the whole operation in 3 days if we coordinate properly." Sarah Chen's offered her cutting horses for separating the calves. Sam nodded, still adjusting to the reality that he was once again part of these collaborative efforts. The spring roundup had been something he and Margaret had looked forward to each year, not just for the practical necessity of managing cattle, but for the social aspect of working alongside neighbors who understood the rhythms of ranch life. After her death, he'd hired outside help to manage his cattle, avoiding the community connections that had once sustained him. "I've been thinking," Sam said, setting down his coffee cup with a decisiveness that surprised him, "about hosting the final barbecue here this year. Margaret always said our place had the best view for watching the sunset after a long day of work." Eleanor's face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Sam, that would be wonderful. The community center is functional, but it doesn't have the character of a working ranch, and Margaret was right about that sunset. There's nothing quite like it from your back pasture." The mention of his wife's name no longer sent him into the spiral of grief that had characterized the past 3 years. Instead, it brought a warmth that reminded him of shared memories worth celebrating rather than simply enduring. Margaret had been the social coordinator of their partnership, the one who remembered birthdays and organized potluck dinners, who made their home a gathering place for neighbors facing difficult times. Sam was beginning to understand that honoring her memory might mean embracing those traditions rather than abandoning them. Rex chose that moment to bark excitedly from the front porch, his signal that visitors were approaching. Through the window, Sam could see Maria Santos walking up the gravel drive, accompanied by her 12-year-old grandson Diego. The boy had been fascinated by the Mustangs during their brief stay, spending hours sketching them from a respectful distance and asking Sam detailed questions about wild horse behavior. "Good morning," Maria called as Sam opened the front door. "Diego has something he wanted to show you if you have a few minutes." The boy stepped forward shyly, carrying a manila folder that he clutched with obvious pride. "Mr. Morrison, I finished the drawings of the horses. My art teacher at school said they were good enough to frame." Sam accepted the folder with careful reverence, understanding instinctively that this was a significant moment for the young artist. Inside were 12 detailed pencil sketches of the Mustangs in various poses, grazing, running, standing alert with heads raised to test the wind. The drawings captured not just the physical characteristics of the animals, but something deeper about their wild dignity and the peaceful sanctuary they'd found on Sam's land. "Diego, these are extraordinary," Sam said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "You've captured something special here. The way you've drawn the bay mare in this one, you can see her intelligence, her wariness, but also her trust." The boy's face glowed with pleasure at the praise. "I want to be a wildlife artist when I grow up, maybe work for National Geographic or something like that." "Grandma says you know a lot about horses and cattle, about how animals behave in the wild." Sam looked up at Maria, who was watching the interaction with quiet satisfaction. In her eyes, he could see an invitation, an opportunity to contribute to this young person's education in ways that went beyond formal schooling. It was the kind of mentorship that happened naturally in rural communities, where knowledge was passed down through practical experience and shared observation. "Would you like to help me with the morning cattle check?" Sam found himself asking. "If your grandmother doesn't mind, I could show you how to read animal behavior, how to tell when cattle are healthy or stressed, that sort of thing." Diego's enthusiastic nod made both adults smile. "Can I bring my sketchbook? I'd like to draw your cattle too, if that's okay." "Of course," Sam replied, realizing that this simple request represented another step in his journey back to community engagement. An artist needs to understand his subjects from every angle. As they prepared to head out to the pastures, Eleanor gathered up her maps and planning materials. "I'll spread the word about the barbecue," she said. "People are going to be thrilled. It's been too long since we've had a proper celebration at the Morrison Ranch." After Elena left, Sam found himself walking through his property with renewed purpose, seeing it through Diego's artistic eyes as well as his own practical ones. The boy asked thoughtful questions about animal behavior, about the relationship between wild and domestic creatures, about the responsibilities that came with caring for livestock. His sketches captured moments that Sam had stopped noticing, the way cattle gathered in specific formations for warmth, the alert posture of a bull protecting his herd, the peaceful contentment of animals that trusted their caretaker. "Mr. Morrison," Diego said as they paused near the repaired fence where the Mustangs had sheltered, "do you think those horses knew you were helping them? I mean, really knew, not just instinctively?" Sam considered the question seriously, remembering the moment when the bay mare had approached him while he worked, the sense of mutual understanding that had passed between them. "I think animals understand kindness," he said finally. "They recognize when someone is trying to help rather than harm. Those horses chose to stay here because they felt safe, and maybe because they sensed that this was a place where creatures in need would be protected." Diego nodded solemnly, adding another sketch to his collection. "That's what I want to capture in my drawings, not just how animals look, but how they feel about the world around them." As they walked back toward the house, Sam realized that the boy had articulated something profound about the events of the past month. The Mustangs had indeed felt something about his land, about him, that had made them choose to stay when they could have moved on. Their presence had created a ripple effect that brought his community back into his life. But more importantly, it had reminded him that he still had something valuable to offer, not just shelter for wild creatures, but knowledge, experience, and a capacity for kindness that had survived even his deepest grief. That evening, as Sam sat on his porch watching the sunset that Margaret had loved, he felt a peace that had eluded him for 3 years. The horses were gone, but their legacy remained in the renewed connections with neighbors who had never forgotten him, in the young artist who would learn from his experience, and in his own rediscovered understanding that healing didn't require isolation, it required community, compassion, and the courage to remain open to unexpected grace.